Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
All right, Chris, thanks for joining, brother.
Hey, pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I've been reading your work. You recently sent me your most up current book. It was Cannabis, the Lost Sacrament of the Ancient World. And then I was initially introduced to the Liber 420 book. I thought that was awesome. And you're a fascinating guy, man. I started to rediscover some of your work recently when I had Kitchens on, and I saw him and Robert Forte. They've both been on my show, and they were having a little debate at one of the bottom of your, I feel like you wrote an article basically going after, not after, but you were just making a response to Brian Murarescu's work.
Yeah, I wrote an article, but Travis Kitchens also wrote an article as well. You might have seen that one. That might have been where Forte was, but my article is quite long and in depth and stuff.
Yeah, I dove into that article and it was pretty awesome. So I was curious, maybe we'll even start with Brian Murarescu. He blew up on the scene, and it seems like he started to write about the same subject matter as you, but skipping a lot of the cannabis part. And you've been writing about this for 3 decades. So let's get into a little bit about what you think the reasoning is for that, if you'd like.
It's like, I wouldn't say it's not exactly plagiarism, you know what I mean? But he conferred with me for 2 or 3 years before he wrote his book, and he'd read like 3 of my books, or he told me he had anyways. I'm assuming he had. And there was definitely things in there that made it into his book without proper citation. But one of the things about the Immortality Key is it's almost more of a what's that guy that writes all those conspiracy books?
Dan Brown.
Yeah, Dan Brown. It's more of a Dan Brown type of a tale, I think, than an actual, scholarly endeavor into the history. He's mixed it with this fanciful tale about himself, and it seemed to me that some of the ideas were worked into that storyline. To me, and I go to this in my article's called "The Immortality Key: Lost on the Road to Eleusis," because I don't really think his ergot theory has the same foundation, say, as for this cannabis material, that we're discussing here. In regards to cannabis, we've got some really solid archaeological evidence, and we know what it was referred to in the ancient world, so we don't have to do a lot of speculation on linguistic ties and things like that. There's definitely linguistic references to cannabis in ancient Assyrian and ancient Persian, ancient Vedic language, these types of things that scholars generally agree on. So it's not as speculative, but yeah, it's like, I don't like to, it's a drag, because I actually, I think there's what's really lacking in the sort of entheogenic history scene is some real critical thinking. And I think a lot of other books as well, besides Murarescu's, I think is a lot better than, say, something like Thomas Brown's The Psychedelic Gospels, which is all about mushrooms in early Christianity, but based on medieval era paintings and stuff that he's interpreted indicate mushrooms, and therefore indicate psychedelic mushroom use, which I think is a bit of a stretch without any more foundational contemporary references to the period about these things, and any sort of form of archaeological evidence, which would be hard to do with mushrooms, but not impossible. They found evidence of ergot use in ancient skulls, locked between teeth, things like that. So I think that in one sense, it's brought a lot of attention to the subject matter, but kind of like Graham Hancock bringing a lot of attention, say, to ancient Egypt, it's in that same sort of category. Is it like, it's not going to stand up to real strong scrutiny.
What do you think about the Immortality Key just gaining so much momentum and having so much press behind it, and the whole idea that Tim Kitchens had? What do you think of that?
Travis Kitchens.
Oh, sorry. I don't know why I always say Tim. Maybe I'm always thinking of Timothy Leary. That's funny.
he obviously was very well connected. You know what I mean? He got like a really big publisher right off the bat for his first book, which is, not an easy thing to get,
Mm-hmm.
So that propelled it, right out. There's so much money behind it right off the bat. That propelled it into the thing. I think my problem with it is he doesn't properly cite other people's work. And it's not just me that has felt this way. There's been other people. I give in my article, I give some pretty solid examples of when and where I thought that he took liberties, and also where I thought he was, not really following the history on certain subjects, like that the actual things he was referring to were just incorrect. And so that's a pretty detailed piece. If people want to go over that, they can go check that out, and they'll see what I mean. But yeah, it's unfortunate because say something like, this information in my new book that I go over, Tellerad, where they found it's the only existing archaeological evidence of an ancient Hebrew temple, and there's like confirmed cannabis resin used at the. We're not talking about like hemp. They got like resins off an altar that show that what the archaeologists believe was actual hashish or some sort of cannabis resin prepared product that was burned in their refined product, right? And people barely know about it, but say something like John Allegro's Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, or Tom Brown, or the Immortality Key. This stuff is pierced into the mainstream. And it's unfortunate because I feel that real, actual drug history is getting overlooked in favor of the fanciful and unverifiable speculation.
Yeah, I'm always curious. And maybe we don't know why, but like, why is this mainstream psychedelic renaissance pushing this narrative with the religious ties to it? And there's a lot of funding behind it, and it seems like these are the popular books. And then the cannabis thing seems to be the one that's always been buried and hidden. And it's like there's been this war on cannabis for thousands of years.
Yeah, a lot of people into psychedelics, they actually don't even consider cannabis a psychedelic, and I think if we're talking about, modern use and, smoking joints and stuff like that, I think it would be kind of hard pressed to push that as a psychedelic. Also with our present, relationship with cannabis, people know it and stuff like that, right? Like, whereas say something like a Tellerad, this was a pretty rare imported product. The whole set and setting, wasn't like everybody had access to it. This was like something that was used specifically in this oracular chamber, the Holy of Holies, small enclosed little 4x6, 4x8 room that would have, been excellent for holding smoke and hotboxing, right? And so somebody going into that and getting high, even if it was not a huge amount of cannabis, just the set and the setting and the scenario also would have enhanced that product. Like what happens in that tent of the meeting, in the story of Exodus, Moses goes in there and he pours some holy anointing oil on the altar of incense, and then he speaks to the Lord in the pillar of smoke, right? And he asks the question, "What are we to do, Lord?" And a voice eventually comes back out of the smoke. Now, when you throw drugs in there, something like cannabis, psychoactive substance, is that not shamanism? Here we have a guy going in, pondering on something, and eventually a voice comes back out of the smoke, and we have cannabis receptors in the area of higher thinking and memory. And there's also an association that people genetically predisposed to something like schizophrenia can also have it exasperated by cannabis activating those areas of their brain, right? So it is a kind of a perfect scenario for that sort of reflective answering to the question, even if it's maybe coming from your own consciousness in a way, your unconscious, subconscious. And I think that's why we see a lot of use of cannabis in the magical tradition, particularly with magic mirrors, which came up a lot in Liber 420. There's actual, 16th century grimoires with references to cannabis specifically for magic mirrors, which is like staring into a black opaque mirror until you start to see something and hear things, and I think this is a tool for invoking the unconscious. And, in the unconscious, what's what tells us our dreams at night. It can be called the unconscious or subconscious, depending on whether you're Freudian or Jungian influenced, right? But it's like a well of memory, that reflects back to us. I think the same thing that tells you your dreams at night is what spoke back to people from the magic mirror out of the smoke in these meeting rooms that we're talking about with the ancient Hebrews.
Yeah. How did you get so obsessed with this subject, and how early on was it in your life?
Oh man, I had a religious experience in like 1990, and that kind of, I was trying to understand. It was with cannabis, and I was trying to understand if I was just really stoned, and that's what it was, or if there was anything to it. And
How
I
old
thought,
were
well,
you?
if anything, what's that?
How old were you in 1990?
27.
Okay, I was just curious.
Yeah, yeah. And so that was like 35 years ago. I started to, at that time, I also found out about the industrial uses of hemp. You can make all your paper out of a fiber. And I lived in an area that was going over a big controversy about the logging of the last old growth coastal rainforest in Canada at Clackwood Sound. And, I started finding out about the uses of hemp for paper and things like that, and thought this might be an alternative, saving jobs and also saving trees, like half the trees go to pulp and paper, right? And building products as well can be made from hemp. And so after that, I thought, well, I'm going to for sure promote these industrial uses of cannabis. And I actually started the first hemp seed food company in North America, I believe, but Canada for sure. Started promoting, hemp cloth and hemp paper and that sort of thing. And then at the same time, I thought if there was anything to this religious experience, that somebody somewhere else would have had something similar, you know what I mean, through history. And so whenever I came across anything that I felt kind of fit into that area of religion and spirituality, I filed it and started collecting it, and then started writing small articles. And then this grew into bigger articles and eventually books and stuff.
That's fascinating. And you were taking massive risk back then because prohibition was pretty high penalty, right?
Yeah, yeah. In Canada, all head shops had been banned. High Times, if you sold to High Times or Grow Books, you could get a $150,000 fine. And initially, I used a pseudonym. I think the first show I went on was Nardwar, the Human Serviette, which a lot of people are familiar with, in like 1991. And I used a pseudonym, Reverend Johnny Freedom, and I preached the wonders of the hemp plant. But eventually, I realized people needed somebody to go to, so I kind of started putting myself out there, and then traveling around to colleges and universities and events and things like that, and teaching people what I knew about hemp at that time.
And you were just an obsessive reader doing research and then getting pretty obsessed with writing at the same time, like just putting it all into form.
Before that was like a light switch moment in my life when that happened. Before that, I didn't write anything. I was just surfing, and I grew a bit of weed, and I couldn't say I was particularly focused on any sort of subjects besides surfing and growing a bit of cannabis, and living my life. And after that, it was I couldn't drop it. It was like I felt at that time, this was when all the Gulf War was happening, that the world was in peril. I feel that way now. The world's in peril more so than I did then. And that this was the answer to our problems. It served as a way to heal the environment by replacing old growth trees with renewable hemp and making building products out of it, producing paints, oils, and fuels from hemp seed oils, getting rid of soil depleting cotton with organic hemp, and feeding the world with the most nutritional single source of protein, digestible protein, the hemp seed, a superfood now. And so all these things I saw as that, and also this incredible medicine, like parents who are dealing with things like epilepsy. For them, certainly this was a miracle, you know what I mean? And epilepsy up until the medieval time was considered some sort of form of demonic possession. So there's a tie there as well, right? And then finally, this idea that it had been used as a religious sacrament. At that time, I was just kind of getting going. But, 35 years later, certainly it is a plant whose leaves of the tree have been for the healing of the nations, in the sense that, you can trace spiritual roots of cannabis back to the origins of Chinese Taoism and Japanese Shintoism. In the Islamic world, with Sufis and dervishes who recognize the mystical qualities of this plant. In Zoroastrianism, which heavily influenced Judaism and Christianity, there's references to people drinking cannabis-infused wines for revelations. In Buddhism, there's stories of how Buddha subsisted on one hemp seed a day before announcing his divine revelations. And medieval Buddhism, there's references to cannabis use for yogic purposes, and every Sikhism as well. The Nihang Sikhs and Hinduism, it's still used in honor of Shiva, the oldest continually worshipped god on earth. And I'd been talking about this idea of Judeo-Christian use for over 3 decades. By the time in 2020, when actual archaeological evidence, which I say confirms the linguistic evidence, I had been basing it on linguistic evidence by the anthropologist and etymologist Sula Bennett, who suggested that the Hebrew terms canna and cannabasum were actually references to cannabis. And she pointed to 5 references in the Old Testament that she said were references to cannabis. And when you take a look at those references in context, and then you take a look at the evidence out of Telluride and what the archaeologists are saying about it, it's pretty clear they're talking about the same thing.
That's amazing. Yeah, I'm curious, when you started to go deeper and deeper into the religious subject matter and seeing that cannabis was basically in our symbiotic relationship for so many years, going all the way back, it probably to you was just like this mystery where you had to keep going. And then when you get into that Gnostic phase of humanity and you see what happened where I just feel like there's always this war against consciousness. And the Gnostics had this more interactive spirituality where it was like, all right, you have the experience and it's inner knowing, whether it be using a plant or a trance state or whatever it was. And that's where all of this really interesting relationship to our earth and to the universe and all that came from. Our spirituality was based on experience. And then at some point, the Gnostics seemed to have been burnt at the stake or whatever it was, and they flip the narrative, right? To no, the knowledge comes from the priest or the authority.
Yeah, similar thing happened in Judaism as well. Like in the early period, cannabis is being used for oracular purposes, as we see in Telluride, but something happened where they stopped. And in the case of Judaism, I believe it's the rise of monotheism, and that's the worship of a single god. At the time of 8th century BCE, in Telluride, Jerusalem, it was polytheistic Hebrewism that was in practice, according to archaeological evidence. And Yahweh, the biblical God, people in the West know as Jehovah, was actually married, had a wife, Asherah, and there were other deities involved in the pantheon. And we know this because of archaeological inscriptions that refer to Yahweh and his Asherah, and depictions of them together. And this Telluride is one of the sites that's known for this evidence of combined worship of Yahweh and his Asherah. They found an inscription there that said, a house of Yahweh. So that was like, but they've also found little statuettes there that were believed to have been images of Asherah at the same site. And the Telluride inner temple, the Holy of Holies, where the cannabis was burned on one altar and frankincense was burned on another altar, is believed to have originally held 2 standing stones, which likely represented 2 deities, Yahweh and Asherah. And the suppression of this more orgiastic, oracular type of polytheistic religion was usurped by the innovation of the idea of monotheism. There's just one deity. And I would say that monotheism was as much a political reality as a religious one. And you got to remember at this time, the two kingdoms of Judea and Israel, the northern and southern kingdoms, were often fighting. You know what I mean? A lot of the contradictions in the Old Testament are due to the merging of the two texts from these two cultures that didn't necessarily see everything in history and religion eye to eye. and they were also under attack by much larger kingdoms, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, and stuff, right? And it's believed at the time, one of the reasons why that the Tellerrad archaeological evidence was so well preserved is because somebody went in there in a day and knocked over these altars, buried them in sand, built a new floor on it, and then went about their business again right on top of it, right? And this buried the stuff in a way that preserved it very well. And this is believed to have happened during the reforms during the time of King Hezekiah. And Hezekiah was particularly focused on removing all evidence of Asherah. He went into the temple of Jerusalem, it's described in the Bible, pulled out all the images of Asherah, but he also pulled out the brazen serpent, which Moses had made, because the people of Israel were burning incense to it to that day. And Asherah, one of her nicknames is Lady of the Serpent, right? And all the images in the temple are also very related to images in the Garden of Eden. We have the two cherubim on either side of the Ark of Covenant. It's a cherubim guarding the way to the tree of life and the tree of knowledge in Eden, and the serpents in there, and the sacred tree in the form of the menorah, which is believed to go back to the time of Asherah. And I argue could well even be a depiction of the cannabis plant, which was so sacred to her cult. And we see in the references to cannabosum and canna in the Old Testament, initially starting out very positive. It's part of the holy anointing oil that Moses is commanded to make by God, who he first sees in flames of fire from within a burning bush, and is burned in the temple. We see it used as an incense in the story of Isaiah, and in the Isaiah references to canna, God actually gets upset because Isaiah doesn't bring any canna and frankincense, and these are the items that are in the inner temple at Tellerrad. And in the story of Ezekiel, it's described as coming from a foreign land. And indeed, the authors of the cannabis and frankincense at Tellerrad report say that the cannabis was imported. No evidence it was grown in the area. There's no evidence of pollen in the strata from that time period. And then finally in Jeremiah, it's fully rejected, and he says, "What do I care from your canna from a distant land? It does not please me." So what was before part of the holy thing is all of a sudden rejected. And this happens at the same time that Jeremiah is condemning the people, surviving Jews who are living in Egypt after the fall of Israel to the Assyrians and whatnot. He's saying it's their fault that Jerusalem fell because they were burning incense to the Queen of Heaven. And so this all kind of fits with that. And again, he mentions also frankincense and canna together, which is again what was found at Tellerrad, right? And so because they're under attack, you got to think like there's no division between politics and religion at this time. There's a situation where you have a really divided population. Some people in the cult of Ashera, some people in the cult of Baal, some people in the cult of Yahweh, and they're all vying for power. And so by consolidating the religion, get rid of all competing temples, consolidating it to just the worship of the main temple in Jerusalem and just the worship of Yahweh, they're able to consolidate the public into one more unified community, and also the wealth of the kingdom into one directed place, which makes it a lot easier to control. And the religion moves away from things like oracular priests, and even by this time after this, they're starting to, anybody that's showing exhibits of being a prophet, kill them, because it's all about rules, how much you pay to the temple, what you pay for certain sins, and the laws that people live by, which may have been seen as more effective politically in response to these larger kingdoms and attacks. Now, the situation in early Christianity, where a lot of these elements come back into play. Gnostics worship not only they followed a goddess, Sophia. A lot of them, Should also point out here the term Gnostic is a blanket term for probably a couple of dozen at least different Christian groups that went by various names, but they consider themselves Christians, followers of Jesus, and anointing themselves and things. And one of the main points of contention is it's about knowledge versus faith. Gnosis means knowledge, and whereas the Catholic Church, which grew out of the teachings of Paul, who never actually met Jesus, came onto the scene later, originally persecuting Christians according to the Bible, and then converting on the road to Damascus after having some sort of vision on the road to Damascus, possibly through some Gnostic sacraments that he'd absconded with when he was persecuting Christians. And also one of the main points of contention we find in Gnosticism versus what became the Roman Catholic Church, the Roman Church of Paul, is water baptism versus anointing with oil. And in the Bible, Jesus baptizes nobody, but he does send out in the oldest of the synoptic gospels, Mark, the apostles with holy oil to cast out demons and heal the sick. And as I mentioned earlier, things like epilepsy could be considered as casting out demons. And we know of many of the medical qualities, and some of the miracles described in Jesus might be, kind of magnified and glorified evidence of medical applications of cannabis, treating a menstruating woman. We know cannabis is very effective in treating certain menstrual problems as a prescribed medicine for these things in the 18th, 19th century, right? And things like, when he heals a blind person, he uses a clay poultice, so it shows that it's not just a mere laying of hands. There's actual activity in some of these things, and in regards to epilepsy, it's believed Assyrian references, which precede this by some centuries, indicate its use for the treatment of epilepsy. They call it the hand of ghost, and cannabis appears in recipes for that, right? And Telerad's not the only evidence of archaeological evidence of cannabis from the region either. There's also evidence tied to Ashura indicating ritual weaving of cannabis, where a cave where a site was found where remnants were found, and it was believed to be a ritual weaving site, and hemp fibers were found there. And from 4th century Common Era, in Bet Shemesh, Jerusalem, they found the remains of a 14-year-old girl who had died in childbirth, but they had been, using topical cannabis on her belly and also burning cannabis in the area where she was found, likely as a treatment and an aid for childbirth. Cannabis's use in childbirth goes back equally as further than that. So that's evidence as well, right? And there's also, lots of these Gnostic texts indicate the burning of, incense. Particularly books like the second book of Jude refer to an incense that contained a wonder. It describes the rituals where vine branches are placed in bottles of wine, possibly indicating infusions, and descriptions of use of Greek words for plants that we know from other references were psychoactive. So it seems pretty clear that entheogen, and also descriptions like the Gnostic Marcus preparing an infused wine and giving it to women to turn them into prophetess, as and that sort of thing indicate, that this was definitely part of it, and this may have made, its way into the Bible. The Book of Revelation, for instance, refers to, in our modern English books, everywhere you see sorcery, it's actually this Greek word pharmakia, which actually makes reference to the magical use of such plants, although condemned in Revelation. You know what I mean? There's obviously different views going on around a lot of this stuff in the early Christian period.
Yeah, what did you think about the Nag Hammadi library? And then as you went on through reading all this stuff and tracking the Christian versions?
When I came across the Nag Hammadi library, I thought, this is the resurrection of Jesus. It brings, it was discovered in 1945. Before that, all we had was a couple of Gnostic documents. There was Pistis Sophia was around, the Bruce Codex, which had the Book of Jude, which I was just discussing.
Can you also describe what the Nag Hammadi library was, like how it was discovered with the Dead Sea Scrolls, things like that?
It was discovered in 1945 in a cave by some goat herders. At first, they just were burning it, using it to start fires and stuff. They didn't realize what a treasure trove they'd discovered. And then by the time that people started figuring it out, it was all over the place. They had to track down and chase down a lot of the documents, right? But it's a collection of what became heretical documents, but which were originally early documents of Christians that did not share the same narrative as the Roman Catholic Church, and the canonized New Testament. And it should be pointed out that that's not the first canonization of Christian documents. Before the New Testament was put together, a guy named Marconian. There's the Marconian Gospels, and these were actually many of the books in the Marconian Gospel are also in the New Testament, but not all of them. But one of the major differences in the Marconian Gospel, and this is true of Gnostic, many of the Gnostic groups as well, is the biblical God Yahweh was kind of seen as sort of a parasitic figure. That was, draining humanity, living off of humanity, and tricking humanity. So it's kind of a reversal of what came down to us through modern Christianity, where it's a carryover from the Old Testament God, which the Gnostics and the Marconian Marcus rejected, right? The Nag Hammadi was a collection of texts from various Gnostic groups, and the guy who hid them, he describes it in one of the texts. He says, "The incense of life is in me, so that I know to bury this in the cave, and it'll come forth at the end of ages, to help those the model forms of poverty at the end of the age, But I think, in a way, it depicts. Even in the New Testament, Jesus says he's speaking in parables, and not everybody's going to understand. Here comes the Gnostic text with his whole new version of Jesus, a laughing Jesus in some case, and a very different Jesus than the Jesus of the New Testament. And that may well be what serves as a resurrection. My initial religious experience was apocalyptic. It happened, this is in 1990. I was working at a fish plant in Ucluelet on the west coast of Vancouver Island, a small little town. And I found out about the industrial uses of hemp and was, starting to think, wow, this could really solve the logging problem. My brother was the logger union camp chairman out there in that area at the time, right? And so I was deeply connected to a lot of these issues. And also at that time, the Gulf War had started in Iraq, and this was being talked about a lot. And one night I was in this fish plant, and I was reading a newspaper, and there was an advertisement for a sermon by Pat Robertson, Revelations 18, the fall of Babylon. And behind me, I pictured tanks and jets. And I thought, well, I'm going to read the book of Revelation right now. And I popped it open and I began to read it. In the beginning of the book there, John the prophet describes being given a scroll and eating it, saying it turned bitter in my stomach. Tastes sweet in my mouth, but turned bitter in my stomach. And then I began to prophesy. So I thought, what did he eat? And I started reading further, and they're talking about people dressed in sackcloth with billowing clouds of incense smoke. And I'm going, this is trippy shit. And I got to the end of the book of Revelation, and it says, on either side of the river of life stood the tree of life, bearing 12 manners of fruit, yielding its fruit each month, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. And when I read that, I had this powerful experience where I felt like light just poured into my body, and that this reference was a reference to cannabis. And that I was like, wow, and I called up my wife at the time. She thought I was having some mental breakdown, started bawling her head off. And the next day I was like, was there anything to that, or was I just tripping, And in the Gnostics as well, the tree of life does play a pretty important role, referred to anointings from the tree of life. And it describes the tree of life being rediscovered at the consummation of the age. And this is interesting with what I was talking about earlier with Asherah, the goddess, who some scholars believe is the foundation for the Gnostic goddess Sophia. And Asherah, as I mentioned, many of the implements inside of the main temple in Jerusalem describe the cherubim, the sacred tree, the serpent, the goddess, are all in the Eden story. And it's one of the names of Eve, Hawa, is actually an epithet of Asherah. So there's believed to have been a connection that the Garden of Eden myth, which is actually one of the later things written in the Hebrew scriptures and then placed at the beginning in the Bible, is actually a demonization of the relationship of Yahweh and Asherah and the sacred plants, trees of knowledge, tree of life, and the serpent. It was burned by Hezekiah when he was doing the reforms and destroying all evidence of Asherah use, and when the temple at Tel Arad was buried. Right, so there is evidence that that cannabis was the tree of life. That's what they refer to the sacred tree of Asherah as, the tree of life. And it's depicted growing out of her pubic triangle often in images. And the desacralization of cannabis is one thing with its own, effects on culture and stuff like that. But the demoralization of women and the goddess has this massive effect for the next few thousand, 2,000 years, that is still felt today. And, what a different world it would be if the elements of femininity were sacralized as the same way as the Father in heaven. If it was a mother in heaven as well, what a different world it would be. Half of, what I mean? I believe that this is a cause for a lot of the imbalance in the world. Like it's overrun by the patriarchy. It's all about penetration, domination, and there's little room for compassion, and we have the last bastions of the patriarchy in power right now. And one of their biggest, things is being against woke. It is interesting to note how woke these ancient worshippers of the goddess were. They had transvestite priesthood, the Quedishim. And, it's not only Asherah in the ancient world is not the only goddess by far. This was a common theme with Near Eastern goddesses. This is the use of cannabis, association with Quedishim and other elements of woke culture is prevalent. And we have actual references to cannabis in the ancient goddess Ishara. There's an inscription that says, what is the sacred salve of Ishara? It is cannabis, and we have inscriptions describing large amounts of cannabis being delivered to the temple of Inanna. And we have descriptions tying it to Ishtar, and possibly the infusion into a sacred beer dedicated to Ishtar. So a lot of these goddesses are kind of probably from the same earlier goddess. And so the similarities in these traditions is as they branched off regionally and took on their own flavor, much like how French and English started as the same language, but, split up into their own thing. This happens with deity worship as they go to different places. And we have, other examples of this is like Soma in the Vedic religion and Haoma in the Avestan religions, both sacred drinks thought to come from the same source, an earlier identical origin, right? And so that accounts for many of the similarities in these religions, similar myths, similar language use, but it also over, hundreds of years split off into its own thing and developed other things that kind of differentiate it as well. But you can still see these original elements in there.
Yeah, and it's fascinating when you mentioned like moving books like the Garden of Eden story to the front end and then demonizing the actual story, and then the removal of certain books throughout the Bible over time, and you lose out on the Mary Magdalene story, you lose out on so many components to keep this, if you want to call it patriarchy, or if you want to do it mind control. It's just really authority, power.
Yeah. Well, in Gnostic text, Mary's the number one apostle, higher than all the other 12 apostles. And, she's definitely not playing that role in the New Testament. That's for sure.
What is your perspective on Mary and Jesus after reading all these years, and like who they might have been in your eyes?
Yeah, it's a possible, certainly indications in the Gnostic texts are that they seem to have some sort of relationship. Some of the other apostles get upset when Jesus kisses her on the mouth. It's like, man, in this modern world, so many people have read things like Caesar's Messiah and stuff like that. It's hard to they don't even believe there was a Jesus, right? It's just a purely mythical account created and stuff. Myself, I kind of believe there's some sort of historical basis for it, a figure, not certainly, but the biblical account is like Romans basically taken over the revolutionary myth that's going on there and slapping a bunch of solar mythology on it. There's no question to me that things like Christmas and Easter are based on existing solar holidays, and reincorporated into Christianity, and borrowed from groups like Mithras and Ates and other figures from the time, dead and resurrecting saviors, that sort of thing. So, I'm not a Christian. I don't, stuff like virgin birth, the resurrection of the dead, all that type of stuff is just out the window for me. It's nothing I believe in. I do think, like Carl Jung, for instance, was very influenced by Gnostic thought and had a lot to do with many of his own ideas. And I think, like, Gnostic concepts like anthropos, a spirit of humanity, may well have played a role in Jung's own concept of the unconscious. Which he said, like for Freud, the subconscious represented a lot of stuff that you say had buried from your childhood, relating to potty training and your relationship to your parents, and these things kind of came up. I don't think Jung disagreed with that, but he thought there was a further aspect to that tapped into a collective memory of the species. And so in this sense, he compared the collective unconscious to the instinctual function in animals. Like sea elephant can get up and go fishing the day it's born. Horses and deers get up and walk around. Some animals go right to work. You know what I mean? And so there's an element of consciousness that is passed on genetically. And humans have this. We've got this, like a lot of, like any other mammal, we've got very similar brains. It's all kind of evolutionary evolved. And so these elements are buried probably deeper inside the older parts of the brain, having to do with things like the pineal gland and stuff like that, which the Gnostics mentioned by name, by the way, in conjunction with a spiritual process. They were tying in spiritual processes with human anatomy and talking about energies moving up from the gonads into the spine, into the pineal, much in a way that kind of Kundalini is believed to work. So they were tying in science with the spiritual process, even at that early date. I mean, it's like 95 AD or something. I think that something like, say, my own personal religious experience, what I look at that now is like something inside of my own consciousness recognizing my thought about it being the tree, the tree of life. Like, yeah, bingo, that's it, buddy. Ding. And so I had a moment of connection to that deeper well of human consciousness, right? You know what I mean? I think has kind of guided me to some extent in my research and where to look, and finding the evidence that I found that I feel is really solid. Like stuff like Tellerad, you just can't argue with that, man. So I think it's a pretty revelatory event for our time, particularly now when you have this whole like freaky MAGA cult that's so based on Christianity. There's like a death cult, this is like inherent. That's how I felt in the 90s too, is it's like this ticking time bomb just waiting to go off, and, whether you believe in it or not, many historical events have been driven by people that do believe in the book of Revelation and are trying to make it happen. Things like the reformation of Israel, for instance, which has to take place before the apocalypse can happen, because it's in Revelation, right? Was really pushed by a lot of evangelical types and people that believed in Christianity. George Bush had people like Jerry Falwell give him advice on Mideast policy and how to deal with it. And it's a driving force for things like when Trump pushed the embassy into Jerusalem, right? Really aggressive move, is all being driven by evangelical Christians pushing this apocalyptic agenda, trying to bring around the rapture and Armageddon and the return of Jesus, right? So this is like a powerful thing, man. It's like, whether you believe it or not, those people are doing that. Now, that's happening on a conscious level. But I also think that the collective belief in that drives it, just people, maybe even like myself and things I'm thinking about, drive that collective belief, and it's driving it to a certain agenda. Now, I'd like to see it kind of go my way and what I've been teaching, but that seems like a pretty distant to me right now. It's like, a couple of years ago, I basically retired because, I hadn't lost faith in what I was doing, or cannabis, the tree of life, but I lost faith in humanity. What's the point, man? It's like, I started thinking things like, there's not a government in the world that is ready to take the stand on things like climate change, global warming, Israel's genocide in Palestine, a war in general, all these things in power. And there's not one that could get elected into power by the people, because that's not what the people want. Obviously, the people wanted Trump over a lot of that this last election, and that's the world we live in. And I don't know how to have that kind of impact that would switch it around. So I've just kind of, I still do interviews, but I haven't been doing any writing or research since I wrote Cannabis, the Lost Sacrament, because I'm just not inspired to. It just seems to me that it's like try to make the best of what the world had left. It's funny because I was when I had my initial revelation, I was totally into surfing. That was my whole life, and then all this work took me away from it. And then when I started having my doubts, I thought, man, I was a lot happier when I was just a surf bum. And I sold off all my property, and I moved out here to Nova Scotia, where there's, some really good waves, but not a lot of surfers, and got back into surfing and just kind of ride it out. But lately, with all this MAGA madness, I'm here in Canada being under the threat of annexation from Trump, I realized there's just no escape from this shit. It's going to come and get you wherever you're at.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So what drove you to write that last book? And what do you think the implications are of the stuff you discovered as far as changing the way the paradigm would shift in people's consciousness?
Well, the big thing was the discovery in Tel Arad, Jerusalem, came out. And so I was like, archaeological evidence. I've been saying this stuff about cannabis for decades, and how's this fit in now that there's actual proof of this? So I felt there was a need to show how Sula Bennett's linguistic theory on cannabosum fit with Tel Arad, and so that was a big impetus, right? And I did start writing it, but I just couldn't get into it. And before I moved out to Nova Scotia, and I sold off all my stuff for about 6 months. I was traveling around with my wife, cat, dog, and parrot in a van. And I was in the city one night. My cat got out, and I lost my cat. And I was, I had this cat for a long time. Like, I get overly attached to my pets. And I thought, by this time I wasn't even going to write the book. I just kept putting it off. My publisher was pissed. I was like a year behind. I haven't even really started it. And I said, I said to myself, well, God, if you give me my cat back, I'll write this fucking book for you. And, I looked around for it all night. The next morning, the cat was back in my van, which was kind of a miracle in itself, because it was downtown in Vancouver, busy area. You know what I mean? There's no way I thought I'd ever see him again, but there he was. And so I was like, okay. And so I just got to work and fulfilled my end of the deal. And now I still have this crazy cat that's pissing on my stuff and kind of a savage,
So when you say that you basically prayed, right?
Yeah.
What is your relationship to the nature of reality and consciousness, and what do you think about it?
Yeah, I guess out of all the different deities that I've, religions and things like that I've studied, I think I mostly identify it the most with Shiva, Lord Shiva, and Shiva is kind of consciousness. You know what I mean? We're all Shiva. And I think that there's an aspect of us that goes, like you have to be taught to be somebody. You're born, you're just this empty consciousness, and you're told your name over. Hey, Jimmy, how are you, Jimmy? And you start to identify with Jimmy. Okay, I guess I'm Jimmy, and that's mommy, and that's that. And you start to build this identity of yourself. But it's really just an idea that you have. It's information in, information out. And that's always changing. You know what I mean? My thoughts aren't the same as when I was 5 years old, or even 40 years old, or 50 years old. Things have changed, and they're always changing. And it's stuff's coming in, stuff going out. And it's same physically. Like every 7 years, they say the matter that makes up your cellular body has been replaced and removed. Old stuff's gone out, skin's died off, new skin's come on, and your whole body over a 7-year period is, so you're basically like a dust demon and a pile of dust, right? And below this identity, there's a collective consciousness that is God, that is that Shiva and Anthropos, and or what the Kabbalists might call Adam Kadmon, and that this is a common core, and that by getting past our emotional centers, which can be seen in the Sephirah, which are basically emotional centers like anger, love, curiosity, these types of things that make up our consciousness. If you can start to strip those away, you can get down to this aspect of consciousness that is the Godhead, and this is where when people have experiences of samadhi and things like that, this is what I would suggest that they're experiencing as they've got past their egos, they've killed their ego, and they've gotten momentarily, at least. I don't think you can ever have more than moments in this state. Gotten down to that aspect of the Godhead.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. And I always get very curious about whether belief systems and religion have caused more harm than good, or what the balance is. But it looks like a lot of damage become available when people get righteous about any belief system, and we get too caught up and too righteous about what we think we know or what we believe in. And I've just come to this idea in my little short journey, and it's going to change, of course, but I'm like, I'm going to stick with the unknown as the mystery. And I'm going to be grateful for the fact that I'm having something appear from nothing, and I'm inside of some sort of complex system that's not separate from me. And then I would imagine it makes me a little bit more humbly to approach it without thinking I know anything. And I almost feel like the thinking, or the righteousness is what's causing most of the harm,
Yeah. Yeah, well, fundamental religion takes all the fun out of it. It's I can't say I disagree. You know what I mean? Like, take a look at the history of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. You know what I mean? And the things that people are doing in the names of these religions today, certainly harmful in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard. I kind of think that in the West here, we're dealing with the Bible, and that's probably what I'm most familiar with. It's like a ball and change going back to the Bronze Age, holding us to these Bronze Age beliefs, and it's like a literary lobotomy in a sense. It prevents people from thinking outside of that. Christians will literally think, "Oh, I can't think that. It's devil's making me think that." Like, they don't have freedom over their own mind. They're in a cage. And you can see it when you're with somebody that has been deeply indoctrinated, and you start to talk to them and raise elements that challenges their faith. Because I know the Bible, I know a lot of biblical stories. Somebody's really religious, I can kind of go into areas of it and start pointing stuff out, and you can see the threat. It's almost like you can feel the girders of their soul shifting as you're speaking to them, because it's like, oh, well, I've just based my whole structure on this thing, and you took this thing right out of it. Now it's crashing over. And yeah, it's has a powerful hold on people, and it doesn't seem like it's good to me. I'm not down with it, and it's like, I think that a lot of what my work on the biblical stuff has been like an attempt to dismantle the bomb. you know,
Mm-hmm.
Redirect the myth in a more healthy kind of manner and stuff. But I don't know that, it doesn't seem to me like, I made some headway, but not anywhere close to enough. I don't know, man. Maybe it's something people will appreciate after some of the heavier shit goes through. It seems
Yeah.
like we're on a bad path, man.
Well, when you were talking about surfing earlier and how you may have just skipped all of it and just stuck with surfing, it's one of those things where we get caught up in the world of language as a species. And that seems to be what makes us so unique and different. And we're so aware of our mortality and our death that we create narratives. We're meaning makers. And then we
Yeah.
cling to these maps and stories. And that becomes what we identify as, these narratives. And
Yeah.
that takes us away from the subjective reality that would be to get into flow or to have a walk or to be like most animals in nature. They're in the experience,
Yeah.
very present. Not to say it's better or worse, it's just different and weird. The fact that we are this linguistic ape with all these beliefs, and we get so caught up in the narrative. And I've been really intrigued by in my little journey. I was basically having subjective experiences about the same age you were. 27, 28 was when I started to have these really profound shifts that started to wake me up to the idea of, whoa, there's a lot more going on than I was told, and questioning the matrix and all that. But then it was like the subjective experiences is where I was having all the downloads and the experiences from the collective or whatever you want to call it. And I didn't have language for it. So it led me down this obsessive rabbit hole of studying Jung and studying all the philosophies. And at the end of the day, I'm coming back to like, it's time to go back and get back on the bike and get back on the mountaintop and get back to living in the present moment, because the nature of human collective consciousness, like you were talking about Trump and all the wars and all the bullshit that's going on that's way out of your control, that's going to happen regardless. It's almost a reminder of surfing being that the ocean is this massive thing. It's so humbling. And you're
Yeah.
this little thing. And the best thing you can do is learn how to surf and enjoy it while you're learning it and get tumbled around, but get back into like just enjoying the surfing and as a metaphor. And I'm basically taking from all this. It's still fascinating to me, but I'm like, let's see if I can get back to being more lucid in my experience while I'm here. Maybe be a little kinder to the people, because you realize we're all just walking, talking programs from our conditioning and our collective culture. And it makes you just, I'm trying to be more curious and have more fun with it and not think I'm here to like change the world, because it's easy to get caught up in that. And I think even the new psychedelic movements, that's what that I didn't like about the Immortality key, and I don't like about the map stuff and the psychedelics, is like everybody's pushing for this transhumanism or this scientism or an idea that's so.
The idea of putting it back in the hands of Catholic priests is like madness to me. It's actually what really preempted my religious experience was here in Canada. There had been in the 80s this massive scandal about Mount Cashel, this orphanage out here on the East Coast. Kids that went there had grown up and they had said I was molested at this. And that's actually what made me go get a Bible. I was like, oh, that's weird, man. What's this Bible stuff all about? I'm going to read the Bible. And that's why I had a Bible to read when I had my experience with Revelation, was because of all these pervert priests trying to figure out what was up with that, So the idea of, to put it back into the hands of the people that burned witches, that destroyed indigenous culture and molested and still molest orphans, and other kids, was madness to me. You know what I mean? Like that's just off the wall. And he actually met with the Pope, you know what I mean? Presented the Pope himself a copy of the Immortality key. I'm not sure what the Pope thought of it, but he's certainly never been. I think the Pope's okay with medical cannabis use, but he's certainly not okay with any sort of recreational or spiritual, would be particularly heretical. I think that this stuff from Revelation, these sorcery references, are going to catch the eye of MAGA at some point, and they're going to start trying to like shut it all down, because it's one of the signs of the apocalypse. People using these devilish drugs, Surfing is like, really, it is about presence. It's not something you could think about when you do. It's really about being in the moment, and even Ram Dass's Be Here Now. Ram Dass is initial guru was some surfer he met in India that was following the yogic path, and it really is about presence and being here now. But I don't think, we can say people can't influence, can't change things, because people can change things. People have made things the way they are now. It's a foreboding task, you know what I mean? But in this day and age, there is this one advantage of an idea can spread around the world in a day, you
Yeah.
know? And I've seen this happen, like around 2002, 2003, I did some article for High Times on Jesus and cannabis, and it got picked up by the global press, and I saw this idea go from my head right around the globe, get reported in all sorts of major newspapers and stuff. Ever since then, I've been trying to reproduce that effect with limited results. But you never know, right? You get something like a series on Netflix that gets into this stuff or something like that. It can really have an effect and can change things. I don't know whether it would be soon enough or whether, like you plan something good. Sometimes it could be a bad effect. I think actually many of the problems in the world are misdirected good intentions.
I agree. Yeah, a lot of the road to hell is paved with good intentions, they say, and a lot of people think, you might have good intentions, but you don't understand enough, to have
Yeah.
that kind of ripple effect. Like if you give certain people too much power, you can start to create on this scale, and it's like you don't know what all the unintended consequences are. It's just too hard, too complex. But anyway, I love listening to you rant and talk about what you've been doing, but we are at the hour. So I was going to ask you, if you were going to die today and you couldn't give people access to all of your life's work, what would you want to share with them?
Oh man, I thought about this, and it's like some of these ideas have just gotten away from me and taken on a life of their own. Like the Jesus cannabis stuff. That's just or the holy anointing and that sort of thing. They don't need me anymore, man. They're already doing their own thing. People are forming churches around some of these ideas. Probably, like I see articles about it. They don't even mention me as my ideas. It's like it's out there. So I think that if I died today, that it would probably just keep stuff that I've done already just is going to keep going on, and maybe somebody, the right person, will pick it up. It's like as an activist, I turned a lot of people on to the wonders of the hemp plant, medical cannabis, and stuff like that. And some of those people that I turned on proved to be even more influential than myself. You know what I mean? Like they took it out into a whole new arena and spread it around. And it's like Jesus says, one lamp lights another, and who's to know, maybe somebody else will come along inspired by some of this stuff and take it to the areas that I wasn't able to take it to. Moses himself never saw the promised land, but people made it,
Awesome. Yeah, I love it. Where would you want me to have people find you? If I'll put it in the show notes.
Yes, put my name and cannabis into Google or YouTube. You'll find lectures and documentaries and articles, all that type of stuff. You can find me on Facebook or Instagram as well. I don't really post too much political stuff on Instagram. It's more just my life. But on Facebook, I'm fairly political and post a lot of cannabis history and that sort of thing.
Cool. And if you were going to recommend your favorite book for people to read, is it your most recent or the Liber 420, or what's your recommendation?
Yeah. It depends what you're interested in. You know what I mean? If you want to understand this biblical stuff, I think Liber for Cannabis Law Sacrament, this biblical stuff is the best book. It's the most up to date with the most up to date information, and Liber 420 certainly covers a lot of really fascinating stuff about magic and alchemy. There's definite firm references in both magical history going back to the 10th, 11th century with books like the Picatrix, and in alchemical literature, there's actual recipes with cannabis for quintessences and arcanums. And my book on Soma as well, Cannabis, the Soma Solution, really, we didn't even get into any of that, but the role of Soma and Heoma is huge. You know what I mean? Like it's like the Bible again, that big into the other part of the world, and the evidence for cannabis's role in that is really strong. And again, based on a lot of archaeological and textual evidence that can't be found in some of the other theories that are around on these things. So it really depends on what area that you want to do. But I have 5 books. I'd say the last 3 are probably the most important: Cannabis and the Soma Solution, Liber 420, Cannabis, Magickal Herbs and the Occult, and Cannabis, the Lost Sacrament are really the ones you want to check out. And you can find, I have a blog over at Cannabis Culture, has loads of articles that will give you some idea of the type of stuff I write about it if you don't want to drop any dimes.
Awesome, man. It's amazing what work you do and how much time you put into it. And I appreciate you for what you do. It's awesome.
Well, it was great talking to you. I hope to talk to you again sometime, Ryan. Take care.
Absolutely. Good talking with you.
Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.